Thank you everyone for joining us for our continuation of our summer series where we've been learning about participatory planning. So hi YouTube world. We are excited to continue the conversation. We have two guests today to help us to continue. So our first guest is Michael Partis from the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. We can't say that 3-4 times really fast. And I'll do a quick intro for Michael. Michael is the executive director at BCDI. He is also a researcher at the Bronx African American History Project, co-founder of the Bronx Brotherhood Project, a community-based college success program for Black and Latino teens at the New Settlement College Access Center. All to say that Michael is very much so involved in the community. He also draws on over a decade of experience as an educator. He's been an instructor at City University of New York Community College and an assistant adjunct professor of urban studies at Long Island University, Brooklyn. He'll share an overview and some history of BCDI and their work. And our second guest is Catherine, and I see Catherine on my lower screen, so I'm so excited. Catherine leads BCDI's work building out the Bronx local planning and policy capacity with grassroots partners and aligned stakeholders toward a borough-wide, comprehensive, and long-term plan for equitable economic development. In this role, Catherine supports local participatory processes and the development of tools and strategies to fight back against gentrification and displacement and fight for community-driven planning and equitable development, also known as Catherine is a badass, just putting that out there. Before joining the team, Catherine supported BCDI's participatory planning efforts for nearly 6 years. Through MIT Collab's Just Urban Economies program, Catherine earned her bachelor's degree from Brown University in urban studies and completed her master's in city planning at MIT. Catherine was born in the DR, AKA also neighbor because I'm from Haiti. Hey girl, hey. Grew up in Boston and is now a Bronx resident. So I'm gonna pass it on to Catherine and Michael.
Hey everyone, hope everyone's all right. Glad to be back with you this week and even more excited to have my colleague Catherine join me. And so what we'll do is we're gonna share our screen in a moment. We will go through a little BCDI history. I encourage everyone, if you wasn't here last week, you can get a much more rich history and social origin of BCDI if you look at last week's YouTube video. So I'll do that quickly. Yep, available now on YouTube, that's right. So I'll do that. I'll still go through very high level, some of the origins of BCDI, and then we want to dig deep on our participatory planning process, which is really about what's a people's economic development plan for the Bronx, which is long-term. So what's a regional people's economic development plan? So I'll do a little history and we'll lean then into the current work that Catherine leads. I will share my screen now and we'll go through a few slides that we have. So BCDI, the Bronx rather, is home to 1.5 million people. It's the birthplace of hip hop and salsa. 90% of Bronxites are people of color. What I think is interesting about that is almost half of our population are folks born outside of the 50 states. We have a median income of about $35,000 a year. Also, two other points. The largest cooperatively owned housing development in the United States is in the Bronx. And the largest worker-owned cooperative in the United States is in the Bronx. What that sets up is for us, how do we leverage those assets, right? So how do we do community-based planning, giving that kind of reality of the cultural innovation, the community groups on the ground, and then the economic realities of our business workforce and other type of enterprises. So BCDI in the first instance is a multi-stakeholder network. That multi-stakeholder network has a commitment to being community-led with a mission of creating an equitable, sustainable, and democratic local economy. Who do we do this work with? What is the intended outcome of this work? Other than an economy that is more geared to community wealth and deep democracy, we have a principal focus on creating shared wealth and ownership for low-income people of color in the Bronx. Much of that is historical, right? The trend lines around the Bronx through redlining, through, I talked about this last week, a number of environmental injustice and housing crises that were socially manufactured. Community groups on the ground responded to and stayed in our neighborhoods, in our communities to fight back. And one of the things that we focus on with what you see on this slide is fighting forward. We take that rich history of the Bronx, we take that rich cultural tradition, we take the organizing, right, tradition and lessons, and we bring a large group of stakeholders together to not just fight back, but to fight forward for the type of Bronx that we want. One way we frame this is hopeful contradictions. And so if any of you have heard things about the Bronx, New York, the left side, light blue, is things you've probably heard before. Poorest urban county in the United States, lowest in health outcomes, highest risk for displacement. What I think people don't know often about the Bronx, we talked about the largest worker-owned cooperative, anchor institution spending. We've done research over the last almost decade and estimate anywhere from $9 to $13 billion a year of spending is done by Bronx-based anchor institutions, as we call them. An anchor institution could be public universities and higher education, 501c3 higher education institutions, medical systems, health systems often, and civic institutions. You maybe have heard of the Bronx Zoo or Botanical Garden or something like this. Those place-based institutions do anywhere between $9 and $13 billion a year in spending. So that coupled with one more aspect here, that the Bronx GDP is about $44 billion, lends itself to say the left side in light blue recognizes the outcomes and challenges, right, in terms of economic status, in terms of health, in terms of housing insecurity. But there is no shortage of business, revenue, and wealth that is actually happening in the borough. How do we get to that center, to that intersection that we call the opportunity to transform our economy? How do we not just fight back on the challenges? How do we not just reform the assets, but how do we get to the center where we fight forward for the type of Bronx that is sustainable, democratic, and ultimately working for all Bronxites, but specifically for the most historically injured and harmed, but the most resilient and self-determined of our population, of our region. And we believe that one piece to that is participatory planning, and that participatory planning that then creates people-centered and created policy, and that there's a facilitative, coordinating, and analytical approach in order to create the Bronx future, the shared vision that we need. And with that, we have our brilliant director who helps coordinate that work, ideate that work, and has been a part of our team for quite some time. And so I will now hand it off to Catherine. And Catherine, could you take it over from here and talk a little bit about our planning and policy lab?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Great to meet you all virtually. As Michael just began to share, the Planning and Policy Lab is one of the core projects at BCDI. And it was, all of our projects are really trying to think about either missing capacities or capacities that really need to be expanded across the borough. And planning and policy that is, again, centered on the folks who live here was one of those things that felt really critical. As you might know, right, planning, there's a dominant tradition around planning that is, has mostly harmed our communities or really left us out of decision making. And many of our partners have taken the lead on creating their own plans or working with other technical assistance providers to think through different strategies, the potential policy, and to do advocacy work. And as part of the work of building BCDI, a lot of our partners really reflected on what it means to have to often translate the lived experience, the conditions, the reality of folks in the Bronx to outsiders in order to get some of this technical assistance. And so with the Planning and Policy Lab, our work really is to think about, again, what it looks like to do this work in a way that is community-led, that is very much informed by the lived experience of folks on the ground and the expertise that already exists in our borough, and provide additional sources of research and analysis, participatory planning and strategy development, and then coordination of various bodies. And today I'm going to talk about the work that we're doing with the BRONX-WIDE Coalition. And so you can go to the next slide, Michael. The BRONX-WIDE Coalition really came together to create a Bronx-wide vision for the future of the Bronx. So really trying to balance not only what's happening at the neighborhood level, but really understanding that having this coordinated vision for a region of 1.5 million people was actually what we need to do to think about the level of impact needed to address the challenges and the scale of the challenges that we're facing, given the assets that we also have. And so you see here the leadership team. So that's the core decision-making body of a coalition that has about 30 organizations. So we have, both geographic representation here, and then, given the diversity of who lives in the Bronx, a lot of these groups are also, bringing that level of diversity in terms of who their members are and who they engage on the ground. And the leadership team is made of both staff and delegates. So, we have a model where we're also trying to, within our coalition space, really model the shared leadership, collective governance that we want to build out in the world. And so each organization has 2 delegates, member leaders, or 4 delegates if they have a youth program. So those are 2 additional youth delegates. And this is really the body that's helping to make decisions and really co-create the set of strategies that we're moving forward. So part of the work that we did when we came together was really to co-create and align on a set of values and principles. So these both guide how we orient around each other in our approach to the work, and also the processes that we've been moving in terms of our policy platform and planning process that I'll get to in a second. So as you can see here, taking a systemic level approach to the work is really critical. We understand that we need to understand the root causes of the challenges we're facing, and that for us, again, to really undo the harms and move forward differently, we really need a systems level approach to the work. We center racial justice. So again, recognizing who lives in the Bronx, the histories of harm and marginalization that our folks have faced really means that we need to center those people and those groups, and also make sure that they're really the ones making decisions moving forward. And then really, again, trying to make space for different lenses and marginalized groups. So making sure that we have an intergenerational approach to our work in terms of who's participating, making decisions, centering gender justice. We recognize that doing this work without an environmental justice lens is moot, right? We can't plan for the future of our borough, of our cities, if there's no planet left for us to inhabit. And so really thinking about the ways in which our strategies is really about centering environmental justice and economic democracy as, you know, the critical framework about for us to really think about how we're transforming the local economy in a way that's grounding and building shared wealth, collective ownership, and governance. And so here, just wanting to share some of the work and process to date, and then we'll talk about what we've been up to this year. So the coalition came together specifically around a moment when we learned that then Congressman Serrano was going to retire, and we would be electing a new Congress member for the 15th Congressional District. And so that felt like a really critical moment given the impact of that election and that seat on the Bronx to take a moment to really create a Bronx-wide vision. And so we co-created a federal level policy platform and really invited any community organization that wanted to participate in the Bronx to move through a set of engagement exercises for residents to identify systemic solutions across 8 systems. We released that platform last summer and then held a candidate forum where community leaders asked questions to the candidates grounded in the platform priorities and that vision that we had created. And then for us here in New York City, we just had primary elections a few weeks ago. So we knew, you know, moving in to the fall that we needed to create a similar platform to make sure that, you know, both residents were engaged, that we can continue this collective work, and similarly to continue to work with engage candidates around the shared vision, and really trying to kind of, you know, change the dynamic around elected or candidates who, you know, say what they want to say to get elected and then, you know, kind of forget that they're working for us. And so this really was about changing that dynamic and setting a precedent that elected officials work for us and should be responding to our priorities. And so we came back together in the fall of last year through the pandemic, still found ways to bring folks together virtually and get feedback on a local level platform, which we then released in January of this year. So that's the Bronx People's Platform for New York City.
Really quick pause, Catherine. I don't know how you want to engage questions, but we do have questions popping up in the chat for you guys.
Thank you. If it's good with folks, I'll maybe come to them in at the end.
Okay.
Great. So here's just a quick snapshot of what this year has looked like for us. So launching and releasing that platform, then set off a set of civic engagement activities where we were both, again, engaging local residents and candidates. And then in the spring of this year, we launched our Bronx-wide planning process and have kicked off a set of people's assemblies over the last 2 months, and are currently now in the space of planning for the next phase of our planning process and thinking about, especially now that we can gather safely in many ways, what engagement looks like in person in the summer and fall. And here's just a visual of our platform priorities and the 8 systems that they cover. So here are just some of the highlights of our civic engagement work. So like I said, we released our platform in January and developed a really robust civic engagement program where our organizations were really working hard to engage their members and local residents in a variety of different ways. So we were able to reach over 250,000 Bronxites through text banking and phone banking to share information about the platform, around get out the vote information, voter registration, and really inviting folks to engage and participate in the activities that we had hosted or began to host. We held candidate forums for all of the open city council races in the Bronx. We also did one for the Bronx Borough Presidency and interviewed candidates for the mayoral race. And then just given the kind of breadth of what the platform covered, our partners continue to move forward with aligned activities, including direct actions. They held community conversations. Folks have developed curricula. And so that kind of reflects kind of the balance of, the coordinated work that we're moving as one kind of solid group. And then the balance of like the distribution of organizations really thinking about the ways in which, they think it's best for them to bring their folks into the conversation and move their work forward. And then as I shared, we just recently launched our BRONX-WIDE planning process. We had a kickoff event in April to really talk about our vision, talk about this, bold idea to create a 30-year economic development plan for the Bronx, and began to host a series of people's assemblies, which were the spaces for us to, again, continue to kind of ground folks in the vision and values, and began a set of exercises where folks could think through the different sectors that we're focusing on, share, their understanding of what the strengths are, what the weaknesses are, opportunities and threats, and then begin to identify systemic solutions together, grounded in that shared analysis that we built. And as I shared, we're gonna obviously continue this process. We wanna make sure that when we say it's Bronx-wide, it's really reflective of the borough, and wanna continue to, now that we can gather safely, think about the ways in which we can connect to folks who we know, weren't able to connect because of Zoom and other barriers. And so continuing to work with our partners to think through interactive activities and also meeting folks where they're at. So spaces where folks are already gathering to really bring in this conversation and make sure that they're participating and engaged. And then the last slide here, and happy to share more. Just wanted to highlight a few things. So, again, for us, this process really is about centering community members, local residents, those who are going to be most impacted by these decisions, to be the ones co-creating this plan and really making decisions about this work moving forward. Our process and the plan is really focused on systems level change, grounded in racial justice and economic democracy. And part of our process is actually also about building leadership development. So we recognize that it's important for folks to engage however they can. And in order for this work to really be successful over the long term, leaders, Bronx leaders, need to be the ones really holding it. And we need to continue to build that civic infrastructure. Because for us, this is about, long-term structural change and building power. And so really thinking about the ways in which we can embed leadership development and learning into the spaces with community members and into the ways that we engage with our partners to build their capacity to do this work as well. And I'll stop there and we can start with the questions.
Thank you, Catherine. So one of the very first questions was from Hendricks. Did you intentionally find and cultivate relationship with religious, institutional, and labor unions to join with grassroots org and leadership, or did that happen more organically?
So that happened organically. The labor relationship was one that we kind of already were holding through another coalition space that we were part of. So there have been, rezonings have been a way that New York City has that's been New York City's approach to building affordable housing. There's obviously a lot of issues that I won't get into now. But as you can imagine, community, really stepped up to push back against those strategies, and Labor's Local 79 was part of an initial fight against rezoning that did pass in the Bronx, and then joined another coalition in the South Bronx to really think about what were the lessons and how might we think about the strategy differently in that space. And so we kind of were in a space where we had been cultivating relationships with them over a few years. And, those are spaces where they kind of also have to show up differently, where around a lot of development sites in the Bronx, it's been community labor until the city gets involved and there's backdoor conversation, and then labor all of a sudden, flips. And so, there was some work done to really make a commitment that they wanted to show up differently. And, we talk about community labor partnerships, and we know ultimately these are the same people. These are the these are Bronx residents that are also getting displaced, who happen to, be part of a union. And so, being able to invite them into that space, I think, has been really exciting, to think about how we can more intentionally cultivate additional partnerships with local unions. And then similarly, the church that's at the table, that was actually a brand new relationship. It came through a partner of ours. But as we were looking at where our organizations were based, there was a gap in the Northeast Bronx, and we were really trying to understand, they're not as traditional community-based organizations. There's a lot of religious institutions, tenant associations, kind of other formation of folks moving work together. And so really relied on our network to help us identify additional partners that would be interested in this space. And so they were really excited to join us. So, a mix there, while also recognizing that I think, for us, we recognize cross-sectoral, partnerships are key. And so we're also, doing the work to really think about how do we intentionally build additional relationships that we know we need to move this work forward.
And I think there was a question around, I hope I was track around what happens at a People's Assembly. So maybe could we talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So yeah, they have been so far the spaces where we've introduced our vision to folks, really try to do some grounding and some analysis building. So we've spent some time really sharing what is economic democracy? Why is that a critical framework for us? Why are we talking about equitable economic development? How is economic development happening now? What's the status quo, and what are we actually trying to shift, and why? So we try to use that space as a learning opportunity, so that there's a little bit of a shared language and just grounding. And then we've begun to do a series of activities with residents. So we started with a SWOT analysis, focused on each of the 7 sectors. And then the last 2 were broken up because we had 7 sectors. So we wanted to make some space for ourselves. So the first assembly in June was focused on 3 of the sectors, and we were able to do a bit of a deeper dive. So, sharing some information and data. Again, when we talk about the healthcare sector in the Bronx, who works in the healthcare sector? What are their wages? How does that align with, health outcomes in the borough? What are the major institutions? So kind of giving space for folks, again, to kind of continue to learn why we're focusing on these areas, what's important for us to understand. And then we moved into, brainstorming systemic solutions. So beginning to think through the SWOT analysis we co-created, what we named were challenges and threats, but also opportunities and assets, and how might that help to inform ideas about what we think is possible. And so we kind of completed that 3 series of People's Assemblies now, and are now beginning to plan what the next kind of series of planning engagement looks like. Some of which will kind of be a recap for folks who might be new, but then again, really thinking about, we're going to have a lot of ideas and a lot of solutions. How do we start thinking through how we prioritize things, the kind of investment and policy needed to support this, the kind of stakeholders we'll need. So that those assemblies were kind of the first set of conversations to really bring folks into the planning process.
Sorry, the next, sorry.
Go ahead, Michael. Go ahead.
I think the next question we got here, Kat, is would love to know more about the shared analysis process. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So externally, that I kind of began to touch on a little bit of that. So a lot of that really was, in Zoom, it's like, how do we break down concepts? How do we, show videos or do short activities to help people to both introduce the concept and then help people kind of understand what that looks like. Another example, we introduced the social determinants of health as a framework. For us, we understand that all of these different pieces are really what impact our health. And so, that looked like asking folks to respond to like what impacts our health, like what makes us healthy, sharing a definition, doing, some polls to help people think through, this pie chart that, in the past we've used as a piece of paper where folks are like filling in, what percentage impacts our health and having folks kind of do polls. So, trying to adapt a lot of activities or things that we would have done differently in person to really using the chat box, the polling as ways to kind of get people to answer questions, share their reactions, and hopefully, digest that concept as a first pass.
We have another one here on, are the people's assemblies where the participatory decision-making process happens with residents? Is it a voting process?
So not a voting process yet. We're kind of currently in the space again where we're trying to make sure there's like a foundational understanding of like what we're responding to and what assets we have, and then beginning to identify solutions. We have talked about the role of working groups, right? So once folks kind of have a body of ideas, like how we move to like, okay, what's actually possible, what's feasible, doing some research to support that, and then coming back and really thinking through the work that it will take to prioritize those ideas. And then what we would hope to do, of course, is like present that back to the community and then think through a series of conversations. We have really tried to use consensus as a way of making decisions. So helping to kind of align to the best possible, right? And move toward like, what can you not live with as a way to really identify really strong points of tension. But for us, we're really hoping that using values and principles and other tools that we've created will really help to kind of frame out, like, this is a universe of what we really want to think about. And our work is really to prioritize that work, think about what can happen in the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years versus what's going to take 30 years. And also be clear, right, that there are some things that we're not going to consider at all. Like if it's going to harm our communities, that's actually off the table. And being, using tools that can help make that work transparent.
I think maybe the one thing I'll add to what Catherine shared is throughout our coalition, one principle value that we hold up, that we're actively making into like a process, is co-governance. And so the idea of co-governance and practicing deep democracy, where what we do is, listen intentionally, listening at scale. Some of you might have heard this type of approach, kind of bringing our way through, I want to say ranked choice voting, but, bringing our way through clarification and understanding. And then, what is the decision-making process, which I think is what the question really starts to penetrate, right? There's all different type of models, majority rules, 5-5, some of you may have heard of that. There's all these other ways. And so we're still growing our way into what will be that mechanism for how do we land and what do we land on something. And so definitely offline or in a different container, we'd love to hear if folks in this group have experiences around that very central decision-making part of co-governance, beyond the listening, beyond the clarification round, beyond that, getting to choose. How does that happen? This is a open space. Definitely, we would love to, we'll see if we have time or we can do it offline, but we'd love to hear some ideas about that. Just running through the questions. I see, how do you engage with, persuade, and or include formal planning and development departments? How do you make their aims? How do you make your aims their aims? Tag, you're it.
Yeah, so I mean, in this process, we're not actively engaging, the Department of City Planning, HPD, which is the Housing Authority, or EDC, which is the Economic Development Corporation. We recognize, once we have a plan, those institutions, we will have to partner with them to really think about, you have the dollars to help us think through how we actually build affordable housing on the community land trust that we want to build, or you have this pot of money to do X, or actually you do have this shared commitment around community ownership. And so what does that look like? So in our current process, it's open. We're obviously prioritizing community members, Bronx residents, but we have not invited them into our process. And we recognize that they exist and we will have to work with them. And hopefully there are avenues for us to have real partnership, but are really working to kind of create that vision and plan to then say, actually, these are the things that we want to advance, and these are the stakeholders that we know we need to work with to do that.
Yeah, I think this is one too, just to vocalize as well. I know that, similarly, you all are having a regional, city kind of participatory planning process. So the tactical questions on how you vote, quote unquote, or decide. I think also, how do you deal with these government and quasi-government, like formal is the word, institutions are very real, right? And in movement building, we have, is it a power building mechanism where we run rigorous campaigns and get them to shift and or transform? Is it an inside out game that you want to play? I think those kind of strategic decisions go beyond, what do we want to see in the energy sector? What do we want to see in housing? There's also the kind of transformation. I mean, we have a rubric that we've been working on to kind of identify what's the deepest level of transformation that a proposal brings to you, whether it's, okay, you want to reform the system so someone can receive money for housing more effectively. You want to reform the system so that rental arrears doesn't prevent someone from accessing social services. Okay, but is that system transformation? Do we want to go for, there's just no more rent arrears, right? With abolitionists, like how deep inside the transformation you want to go? I think that's something that we're working on, and it's something for all of us in movements to think about. And then even beyond that, then to the point of who can you partner with? Who can't you? How do you? What's the power analysis, the stakeholder analysis, like those sort of things. It's a process, a learning cycle that we're in right now, learning from the other campaigns in New York, for on and on and on, the other campaigns in the Bronx that we've been fighting. How do you partner? The ways that you partner, shift versus transformation. And I think communities of learning, like what you all are doing, are important for us to continue to sharpen that as well. I think I'm down to some of the final questions. This might be repetitive, Kat, I apologize. All residents are part of the formal decision-making process. And yes, is it more informal brainstorming and synthesis process? On brainstorming, it's open access per se. If you're a Bronxite and you're aligned to the values of the coalition, this is open access. Aligned to the values doesn't necessarily mean you agree with, oh, I think we should be, making 500 units of community land trust housing. That doesn't mean agreement or disagreement with that doesn't create a barrier to participation, but the values, we're going to use economic democracy, we're going to be intergenerational. That is important for people to enter the space in an aligned way. So there are no barriers to entry other than that we prioritize Bronxites, we prioritize those who align to the values, but there's a ideological and tactical kind of struggle on the strategy, the decisions, and we're still working through that. For the synthesis process, similar. Okay, you want to take the synthesis one?
Yeah, so part of our work is the wide container and then the leadership team as the like smaller container of staff, most of whom are Bronx residents and member leaders. So volunteers who are Bronx residents who have kind of taken on a leadership role. So we're kind of moving, I would say, you know, through this process. And again, we're still building out the process as we're going, moving through like, what are we hearing and learning? How can we synthesize that in a smaller team and think about the next steps in terms of like, who are the voices that maybe weren't there? And so we know we need to continue to engage folks and then share that back out and say, this is what we heard, you know, what's missing, what's the next step? And so really facilitating folks through a process. And then of course, we're then gonna have to, as Michael said, right, come to a set of decisions around what ends up in the plan, how we prioritize some of the nitty gritty. That again, I think we can have a level of that in a large space. And again, wanna think about working groups or other bodies where folks who are really excited around really actually digging into like, what does it look like to do community-owned solar in the Bronx, to make those space, so that we're kind of balancing the levels at which community residents are also interested in engaging and really thinking about the ways in which we can kind of support with additional research and analysis and capacity building along the way.
So I'm on mute. I'm going to come back to the community alternatives to policing question. This one is a little quicker. Has the housing co-op, is so the largest housing co-op city? Answer that one. I'll drop a link after I finish. Is that housing co-op politicized and involved in economic democracy work? Complex question. So how fast can you make it? The co-op city, the largest worker cooperative, in the 70s when it opened, was actually majority white civil servant. And there's a lot of, you know, if you think about policy, public policy, and from Ira Katznelson, affirmative action for white people and all of that sort of thing, you can kind of understand some of those mechanisms. Of course, it's shifted over time. By the time you get to the 90s, it is majority BPOC residents who are working class and civil servants. But some of the housing conditions, right? The repairs that are needed, the, you know, upkeep, all those sort of things have become challenges. All of that being said, we do have, you know, one of, I would call one of our strong allies in the Bronx, Kazembe. Kazembe lives in Co-op City. We've begun to think about what is the organizing and canvassing that happens in the northeast section of the Bronx. Our faith-based organization, Bronx Bethany, they're in that part of the Bronx. They're right next to public housing, Edenwald projects, and about 10 minutes away. So I'm getting hyper local, and about 10 minutes away from Co-op City. And thinking about what is the engagement in that area, right? The outreach, the canvassing, the bringing folks into the process. So from allies in our network through literally one of the organizations in the coalition is in that area. We're working with them to take the lead. They know their neighborhood and their community the best. I see the question about East Orange. I'm gonna go back real quick to the alternatives to community policing. Kat, can you talk about that? And I'll drop Sisters and Brothers United link in the chat box.
Yeah, so criminal justice, as you saw, was one of the systems that we named in the platform. You know, we did name defunding the police as part of a priority. We talked about, and actually this obviously overlaps with education, but removing police and school safety agents from schools. And then, yeah, investing in existing alternatives around supporting folks with mental health issues, and just really thinking about what does community safety actually mean for us, and how do we invest in solutions that are coming from community when it comes to that framework. We're not focusing on criminal justice specifically in the Bronx-WIDE plan. We're like kind of using the sectoral frame, but as you can imagine, all of these issues are intersecting. So part of the next steps is really for us, like, how do we take those policy priorities in the platform and start thinking about what it looks like operationalizing them. And some of that work actually just looks like supporting existing coalitions that are already doing work, across the city and state to move some of that stuff. So part of the platform is actually uplifting work that is already happening because we agree and think it's important, and we don't think we need to, reinvent the wheel. And so a lot of our work is really thinking about, where are we showing up in solidarity with existing organizations and coalitions already moving different components of this work.
Yep, last question. Sorry. Anyone want to ask the last one?
And thank you guys for dropping all of these links. Definitely want to make sure that they're captured in the notes. That's awesome.
No worries. We'll hit save chat. Make sure you all get that. Last call. Oh, is it last call? Or we have to let you all go at 7:15.
I have a question. What has been your favorite part of doing this work over the past, what was it, a year? Over a year? A little bit over a year?
Yeah, I guess one of the things that immediately comes to mind is just our people's assemblies. Some of, I guess the first one is on Facebook Live, but just every time we have the events, different folks step up and play different roles. So we have different folks facilitating, breakouts. We've had different co-hosts. We've had folks perform spoken word. And we have our resident DJ, Michael Pardis, playing music for us. And it's just really powerful to kind of see such a in-your-face reflection of like the diversity of the Bronx, the diversity of our leadership team, just all the ways in which, folks who are, taking on leadership for the first time, even within their organization, step up to really help co-create this process and to make these events possible. So I'm always just very proud of our folks, and we're usually just blowing up our phones with like the 20-person, group chat, sending mad love to each other and just appreciation. So every time we do that, it always just feels really incredible. And even though this is a really big vision and this work is generational, it always makes me feel like it's possible. So.
Kat, am I supposed to do a serious best moment or like a fun best moment?
Might as well do a fun one.
So I'll be super personal. This was my favorite moment when we had Jamal Bowman come speak at the assembly. I knew that he likes Wu-Tang, the hip hop group. And so we timed his walk on and walk off music to be Jizza Liquid Swords. And then since he's a 90s rap head, Gangstar, Mass Appeal. Oh, shout out to Roxbury. Shout out to Massachusetts, right on time. So that was like, and then he stopped the whole thing, went off script, and we had to have like a little conversation about like how do we know what he would be into. We said we did our research, and the Bronx is the home of hip hop. But that small little moment where for all the serious like movement building, power building, transformation, like policy, the wonky stuff, all of that, but that we've had those little moments of like fun and joy because these, our movements need it, right? Period. So that was my little like favorite moment. I will drop the link, as chat mentioned, not to the Jamal Bowman one, but to the kickoff for the Bronx-WIDE planning process. And in a few weeks, we'll have like a mega cut of all the assemblies. I'll get that to y'all, but for now, I'll put the launch event in the chat box. And I think that's it. I think we are over our time, so let's not overstay our welcome. Let's
That was a great way to end. Thank you for sharing that because it tied in really well to our check-in question about joy. So thank you, Catherine and Michael, for all of the gems that you dropped. I know for a fact that I'm going to have to re-listen to the YouTube just to sit with all of the knowledge that you guys shared. So We appreciate it. I think everyone's giving like a hand in the chat. We're happy to be in this work with you guys. And at this present moment, we're gonna wave goodbye to the YouTube world and stop recording.